Back in 2019, Garmin released the GNX 375 navigational unit. It's a budget-friendly but still pretty capable little unit that has quite a few features built in for such a small form factor. In this video, I'm going to walk you through step-by-step how to use each and every one of these features in the Garmin GNX 375. Let's dive in. So for demonstration purposes, in this video, I'm going to be using the Garmin GPS Trainer app. It's a fantastic resource. It's free to download, so I highly recommend you download it, and you can even follow along with me. So when you first turn on this unit, you will see that there's the database screen. And what you want to do is you want to verify and make sure that your databases are up to date. So here you can see that all of these are expired, but with this being the trainer app, I'm not too worried about it. However, if yours are expired, you need to go on Garmin's website and purchase the most frequent database update, and then you can download it to the unit. Reference the pilot guide on how to do that. There's a couple of different ways through the SD card or Connext, depending on how you want to do it. Starting out, we also want to enter our fuel on board and fuel flow. If you don't have it connected to an engine monitoring system, this will need to be manually updated. So we'll just simulate full fuel on a Piper Dakota, 72 gallons of fuel and 14 gallons an hour of fuel burn. So you can see it's going to run some tests when you first fire it up. So we've got the terrain test going on and just a message saying that we're in demo mode. And it brings you to the main menu. Now, before we dive into each of these applications on here, I want to begin by talking about the physical controls on this unit. This button over here on the right is the home and the power button. So from anywhere in the GPS, you can press this button to get back to this home screen. And then if you want to manually power down the unit, you can push and hold to power this unit down. The other physical control on this unit is the lower right-hand knob. So it has lots of different functionality built into it depending on what page you have active. However, my favorite feature of this knob is the page shortcut option. So you can turn the larger diameter portion of the knob to the left or to the right to access different page shortcuts. And these are configurable. So you can quickly bounce between your top three, well, technically top two because the map has to be the first option. But if you want to go back and forth between the map and terrain quite frequently, you can. I typically prefer to have map, traffic, and the flight plan because those are probably my most three frequently used screens. But you can configure that however you want, and I'll show you how to do that closer to the end of the video. The small diameter portion of the knob does zoom the map in and out. So that's a really handy function just given the small size of this touchscreen. You can like pinch and drag your fingers like you would to zoom in on your smartphone. However, just on this screen, especially if you're in turbulence, it can be kind of difficult to do. So just zooming on the knob is probably the easiest way to navigate this unit. And I feel like the intervals are pretty well spaced, so you can get some good use out of it. So the last functionality of the lower right-hand knob is to push the small diameter portion in, and that typically just enters something. So although it's going to be dynamic based off of what page you have open, it has multiple features built in. So on the map, when you push, it's going to hide the user-defined fields in each corner. So if you are flying around, especially trying to navigate around airspace, you can push these fields to really free up the map and give you some good real estate to work with. So it also acts as a way to enter something. So if we want to go to Stockton, we can push the knob instead of hitting enter to activate that flight plan or that direct to or enter that transponder code. So it's just a very useful feature. So you already saw a little bit of it, but we'll talk about the direct to button now. This is going to be kind of the core way of using your GPS for simple navigation. So you can see from a waypoint, we selected Stockton, and then we can hit activate or we can push the knob, and it's just going to do a simple point-to-point navigation, like here from Bolivar to Stockton. Now you can also load a couple of different things in here. So if you have a flight plan queued up, which we will go through here in a little bit, you can activate individual legs of the flight plan from here, and then it will automatically sequence each leg after that. Or you have a list of nearest airports right here. So it's going to show the top 25 closest airports to you within a 200 nautical mile radius. So it's really handy for if you need to get on the ground quickly, you can just hit nearest and then select whichever airport's closest, go activate, and now you're navigating there. Now another shortcut that I want to tell you about is if you're on the main menu right here and you want to access the direct to screen, you can also just push the knob in and it will bring it up. Now, it won't do this from the map or from any of the other screens, but it's just a nice shortcut. If you're in turbulence, you don't want to fiddle around with the touchscreen, you can access it. Okay, let's move on to talk about Transponder Operation now. So this unit is unique in the sense that it has a built-in transponder, so you don't need a separate unit. However, if you have it coupled with a separate transponder, you can remotely control it from the GPS as well, or you can still push the physical keys. It's just up to you. So we can open the transponder box by pressing on the transponder code, and here it allows you to enter your transponder code. Now there's a couple of different ways to do it, where you can use the lower right-hand knob to select your code, like more of a traditional old-style transponder where the smaller diameter knob selects the number, and then the large diameter knob allows you to move over to the next slot, choose your code, so on and so forth. Once you have that code entered, then you can push to enter that code, and there you go. Unless I'm in turbulence, I typically will just enter the code. So say we want to go to 0167, we can go to that code and hit enter. Now we're squawking 0167. Now we can't ident right now because we are currently in standby, so if we want to change the mode, we can change it to on or altitude reporting. So standby is not going to report anything, but it is going to receive ADS-B data from other sources. If you turn it to on, it's going to report your current location, but it's not going to report your altitude. And if you have it on altitude reporting, it's going to share both your location and your current altitude. Now that we are on altitude reporting mode, we can ident. So if you need to ident, you can press that, and then you can see the little green ID pops up in the lower right-hand corner to signify that we're identing. Now, when ATC tells you to switch to advisory frequency and squawk VFR, if you're flying into a non-towered airport, instead of typing in 1200, you can just hit this VFR button right here, and it's automatically going to squawk 1200, and then you can hit enter. Now, the last thing within the transponder screen is going to be in the menu, and you may or may not have access to all of these. Here in the middle, you have the option to enable and disable ADS-B out. I highly recommend just leaving that on all the time. You can configure the data field that populates up here. So you can switch between your pressure altitude or your flight ID, your call sign. And then if you need to modify your flight ID, you can do so right here. This is the one that may be deactivated, probably for most non-commercial aircraft, will just be your tail number. So the next button that I want to talk about is the flight plan hotkey, which is available from the map, and it's over here in the lower right-hand corner. Now this is something that I really wish the GTN series navigators have. I fly with a GTN 650, and it's missing this. So if I want to go to the flight plan, I need to either use the page shortcut option or I need to hunt it down in the menu. So this is a really nice feature, and if you want to access your flight plan, just tap on it, and here you go. Now the other useful feature is your CDI scale is built into it here as well. So on some of the other units with a larger screen, the CDI scale is down here at the bottom, or on the 650 it's in the default nav screen. But here it wants to preserve this screen real estate, so it's over here on the right. So I really enjoy that. This is a super nice feature for being able to just quickly access your flight plan at any time. We will spend more time in the flight plan screen further on in the video, so don't be worried that we're going to move on from here. Okay, so we've played around with the map already a little bit, but let's dive in because it's a very rich feature and it's probably where you're going to be spending most of your time. Like we said earlier, you can zoom the map with the lower right-hand knob and you can push to hide these user fields. When we click on the menu, we can see that there are a lot of configurable options for this map, and we're going to go through every single one of them. The first one that we will talk about is the map orientation. So we can toggle between north up, track up, and heading up. I typically like the default setting of track up, and then it's going to default to north up when you zoom out after a certain distance. Now that distance is configurable here. So you can see I currently have it configured for north up above a 30 nautical mile range, but you can change that to any figure that you would like. This visual approach key dictates when the visual approach button will appear on the map. So we currently have it configured like we're flying direct to Bolivar, and jokes on them, we're actually at Bolivar right now. So the visual approach button is down here in the bottom left. When you are further than 10 nautical miles away, or whatever you set this distance to, this field will disappear and there will be a user-defined field that pops up in its place. So if you frequently shoot visual approaches and you want to load them at the last second, this is a good feature to have. When you get within 10 nautical miles, you make your initial radio call, and then you can load the visual approach. But if you don't use it, you can deactivate it, turn that off, and now you've got this user field down here all the time. Just a matter of personal preference. I will note that you can still load a visual approach without this key, you just have to do it through the flight planning screen. Now this configure user fields button allows you to configure those 4 user fields around the end of the map. So I can't remember what the default configuration is on these, but this is kind of how I like to have it set up. Time to TOD is very handy for when we want to use the VCALC function, which we are going to dive into. It essentially counts down to when you need to start your descent on a long cross-country flight. I have GSL altitude in here just for shooting approaches on the simulator, so you can see your actual altitude change when you have it coupled with an approach or a VCALC descent. However, you probably don't care about that in an airplane because you're going to reference your altimeter for altitude, so this field can be whatever you want. Ground speed, super handy. I always like to know how fast I'm going over the ground, so that one's default. I like it there. And then the distance from and bearing to your destination airport is really nice for making VFR radio calls. So when you're navigating, it'll say I'm X number of miles north of Bolivar. So it's really handy for if you're just making your traffic call, you don't have to guess or look at your CDI backwards. You can just look at that. So like I said earlier, this is just how I like to have these fields configured. But look, there are so many different fields available that you just need to take some time, go through each one of them and see which four you would like to have up there. So that's a really nice feature about these Garmin units. It's just how configurable they are. Once you have this GPS configured how you like it, everything just runs so smoothly. Now we can back out of these user fields, and I will note that you always have access to restore them to factory defaults. So if you get it so jacked up you can't remember what it used to be, just hit restore user fields and there you go. You're back to whatever the default configuration was. Here you can change the map detail. So you have a couple of different options to just free up some of the real estate on the map and make it a little easier to focus on. Personally, I like full map detail, so it's not an issue. But if you want to reduce it, you have the option here. So coming back, we can talk about some of the map overlays. So this is just various information that you can overlay on the map. The topographical scale will shade the ground based off of its relative altitude above sea level. So as we zoom out, you can see that the Rocky Mountains get darker and the lower, flatter areas remain green. So it's just a nice way to add a little more detail to the map and see where you're going. If you don't like that, if the map's too busy for you, you can turn that off and it just kind of makes the basic bland black map. So it's just however you want it configured. So you can enable the terrain overlay here as well. So this is going to shade the map based off of your relative clearance to different obstacles and the ground. So you can see like here at our current altitude of 4,500 feet, we would have collision issues with the Rocky Mountains. So as we would begin to descend, it would change the relative shading. Ultimately, yellow has less than 1,000 feet of clearance and red means you have less than 100 feet of clearance. So just good things to keep in mind. It also works with obstacles as well. You have the option to enable the ADS-B traffic overlay on the map as well. So this will show targets within 25 nautical miles of your current location. So you can view them and their relative altitude to you. So the up arrow means that they are ascending, plus means that they are above you. And then if there's no arrow, means they're flying flat. And if there's a down arrow, means they're descending. So it's a really nice feature to have. You have more access to more detailed traffic information on the traffic screen, which we'll talk about. Now down here in the bottom left corner, we have the option to enable NEXRAD overlays so you can see a mosaic of precipitation data. Now I will say you can only have terrain, lightning, or NEXRAD enabled at once. So you're limited on that front. Now I typically roll with NEXRAD turned on and the other two turned off. If I want to view terrain data, I will go to the dedicated terrain page. And if I want to view lightning strikes, I will go to the dedicated weather page. So NEXRAD's just nice to have because rain's probably the most probable thing that I'm going to be dealing with. Now, when you click on NEXRAD, you have to choose between continental United States or regional coverage. So ConUS is going to show a low resolution image for the entire lower 48, whereas regional is going to show a higher resolution image, but you're restricted to a 200 nautical mile radius of the closest ADS-B tower that you're connected to. Now, one thing that does kind of bother me with regional coverage is that it puts this shaded circle around here and makes the entire map darker, which I'm not a huge fan of. But if you're getting close to storms, you are going to want that higher resolution coverage. But typically, ConUS is good to just know like the state of precipitation in the United States. So we can come over here and see, you can see it's not a high resolution image by any means, but you can still see good enough to know, hey, I may not want to navigate through this area right now. Now the lightning overlay is going to show lightning strikes kind of like a storm scope, but not quite in the sense that they don't fade with time. Now it does tell the difference between an individual strike and a cluster of strikes or a cluster of electrical activity. Unfortunately, there's no lightning data loaded into the simulator, so I can't show you what it looks like. but it is a nice feature to have if you're trying to dodge thunderstorms. Now the METAR overlay is going to throw a bunch of different colored flags across the side of the country. Now for some of these overlays, for some reason, this only works in the Pacific Northwest, but rest assured it's going to show at least regional coverage wherever you are at the given time. But you can look at these flags and see that the different colored flag depicts the different weather conditions in that area. Now I'll throw up the scale for the flag so you can see what the different colors mean. But if you want to view more information and view the METAR, click on the flag and click over here, and you can view the deciphered METAR, or if you scroll down, you can view the raw text data. So it's just a matter of personal preference. And then if there's a TAF for the area as well, you can view that forecast down here. So this is a really good way to get access to METARs in the area. And then if you zoom out, you can really get a good gauge of what areas are IFR versus VFR in the country. Maybe use that in your decision if you want to get on top of the clouds or not. I don't know. So the TFR button is going to enable TFR overlays on the map. So they're indicated by these yellow squares or circles, depending on what they are. Typically, I think the square TFRs are kind of the permanent ones, mostly around power generation plants. And the yellow circles are going to be the temporary ones. So I think over here, this is the one around Arrowhead Stadium. And you can view more information from the altitude to the times that it's active, stuff like that. I do want to preface this and say that although this is an approved source for TFR data, you shouldn't solely rely on your GPS and the databases there for TFR avoidance. You should still get in contact with flight service and make sure that there are no TFRs throughout your route. The last thing you want to do is get complacent and bust an airspace on a cross-country flight. So here you have the option to enable or disable smart airspaces, and it's going to de-emphasize non-pertinent airspace. So if you're flying well above it or well underneath it, it's not going to remove it from the map, but it is going to make it a little more opaque, so it's not so much in your face, something you have to worry about. However, pertinent airspace, airspace that's coming up, or airspace that's within 1,000 feet of your altitude will show up in full opacity. So it's kind of nice if you're flying over a metropolitan area. It lets you look and see which airspaces you really need to be worried about. However, if you don't like it, you can enable it and it'll just show the traditional airspace map like you're used to. So here you can enable and disable airways. So you can choose to view low level, high level, or all airways, or my personal opinion, I just leave them off, but it's up to you. And then you can also enable and disable obstacle and wire overlays on the map as well. So when you get within 2,000 feet of a tower or a wire, it's going to show up on the map. So if you're within 1,000 and 2,000 foot of clearance, it's going to show up as white. If you get less than 1,000 foot of clearance, it's going to go yellow. And then less than 100 feet of clearance, you're going to switch to red. So I typically leave it on, especially for, flying around the pattern. If I've got some tall cell towers in the area, I want to know about them. But if it gets too busy for you, you can go ahead and turn those off. Here you can turn on the topographical scale. So it's going to show the altitude of the different shaded areas. On this small screen, real estate's kind of precious, so I like to keep it turned off, but it's up to you. And then here you have the option to enable the range ring. So this is this white ring around here that shows about how far it is. So the edge of this ring is 80 nautical miles. And as you zoom in, that number changes. So it's a really good way of kind of judging your distance on a map, especially if you're in an unfamiliar airport. And it's also got these compass indicators on here, so you know the rough direction that you're going. Now, a head view is a pretty cool feature of this unit. So I'll go ahead and turn it off. And we can see that it puts the plane in the middle of the map. So you can see an equal amount of distance in front of you and behind you. Now, I don't know about you, but my airplane's not very good at flying backwards, so I typically only care about what's in front of me. So when you turn on a head view, it's going to shift your own ship lower on the screen so you can see more data in front of you. So this is a really handy feature to have when you're limited on-screen real estate. Now you also have a track vector that you can configure, so that's going to be a little blue arrow that is in front of your aircraft when you're moving. And you can set the duration of that vector as well, so you can kind of know I'll be over this obstacle in 60 seconds when it's at the end of the arrow. It's also a good way to see the difference in your crab angle because your own ship will be facing straight and then your track will be spaced off to the side, so you can kind of get a gauge of how much crab you have in a crosswind. And lastly, if you get this map so jacked up that you don't know where to go, just hit restore map settings and it'll bring everything back to default. So you can tell that this map screen has a lot of features built into it and it's very customizable. Don't be overwhelmed. Just play around in the simulator app and figure out how you want this unit configured. So now we can move on to talk about some of the more specialized screens, and we'll start with traffic. So traffic allows you to view more detailed traffic data. So it blurs out all the topographical information and just shows other targets in the area. Zooming can be done the same way as the map, so you can use the knob or you can pinch and drag with your fingers, either or. And if you have a target that you want to view more information on, you can click on them, and then you can get their tail number, aircraft type, closure rate, track, and their ground speed. If you have two targets that are close to each other, you can toggle between the two of them with this next button, which is kind of nice. And you can see that as they move around, they have a vector out in front of them, which is configurable as well. Now on the traffic menu, we have just a couple of different options here. Just leave ADS-B display enabled if you want to view traffic information, and you can change your motion vector here. So you can choose between an absolute or a relative motion vector. I actually typically prefer to have it on absolute, and it's going to change their vector to white, but it's going to show their ground track as it's overlaid on the map. If you choose an absolute vector, which is the green ones that we saw earlier, the GPS is trying to assume where your vector and their vector is going to intercept based off of how they're both moving. It just gets a little confusing for me, but again, it's up to personal preference. The most accurate way to have this screen configured is going to be a short absolute vector. Now, when you ask about, well, what does short mean, you can change the vector duration here. So you can go from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. So your 30-second vector is going to be your most accurate, but your 5-minute is going to be the longest. The downfall of a longer vector is that it's assuming their current track and ground speed. So if that changes, now the vectors are swinging around, and that's just not really useful data in my opinion. I think 30 seconds to 1 minute is about the sweet spot to see if you're on kind of a collision course. Now you can change your altitude filter here. So normal is going to be plus or minus 2,700 feet from your current altitude. Above is going to show targets 2,700 feet below, but 9,900 feet above. Below is going to show targets 2,700 feet above, but 9,900 feet below. And unrestricted is just going to show all targets. Normal is pretty good for a single engine piston aircraft. Typically, like, you don't care about airliners flying 30,000 feet above you, so it'll filter those out. But if you're flying a jet, something a little faster, something with some climb performance, you may want it to be on unrestricted. Just kind of depends on your use case here. The last setting within the traffic map is traffic grouping. So that's going to group targets together, and that's indicated by an asterisk. So if you see a target with an asterisk by it, that means it's more than one aircraft, but it is going to display the most pertinent aircraft to you. So typically the closest aircraft in that group to you will be the one being displayed. So we can pull out of the traffic screen and move on to terrain, which is very similar to the traffic. It just has to do with ground-based data. So it's the same thing where you can zoom it just like the map, and you're limited to 200 nautical miles, whereas on the map overlay, you can view it for the entire continental United States. But it's going to shade the ground based off of your relative altitude to it. So if we descend, you can see the yellow starts to creep up, and then ultimately we get into red. It is configurable here in the menu, so you can disable terrain warnings here if you're, I don't know, doing something you shouldn't be. You can adjust the view, so 360 degrees is going to show the full circle around you like we saw earlier. But if you want to view an arc, which is just the terrain in front of you, you can enable that there. You can choose to overlay your flight plan, so it'll overlay the magenta line from where you're navigating on the terrain map, which is kind of nice. And then if you want to view the legend, you can enable terrain or obstacle legends on the map, and you can kind of view the scale here, although it's pretty easy to memorize. Okay, so let's move on to talk about FISB weather. So this is going to let you view much more detailed weather information overlaid on a map from the FISB data source. And if you go to the menu, you can see just how many different layers you're able to turn on. Now, some of these can't be enabled with another one, so that's just something to keep in mind, but you have access to so much weather data, it's almost overwhelming on a screen this small. I'm not going to go through the details for every single weather overlay on this unit because we'll be here for another 30 minutes. But if you want to view the detailed weather information, click on the video up here in the top right-hand side of the screen, and I'll run through each and every one of these weather overlays on the Garmin GPS series navigator. So the nearest menu is going to show different waypoints, airspaces, frequencies, whatever, based off of your proximity to that area. So if we want to view the nearest airports, which we've already seen this list through the Direct To button, it's going to show the top 25 closest airports to you within a 200 nautical mile radius. Now, this list is configurable, so you can change the runway parameters based off of length or surface type, so it doesn't recommend runways that you can't land at. That's in the system setup screen, which we'll talk about closer to the end of the video. But this is a really nice feature to have, where if you need to get on the ground quick, just select the nearest airport to you and you can go to it. Now, the same can be done for intersections, VORs, NDBs, user waypoints, airspace, and then you have these 3 different frequency options down here. So if you want to view the center frequency that services your area, click here. And you can see Kansas City Center is on 127.5 servicing this area. If you want the nearest flight service station, you can view Columbia Flight Service here. And if we want the nearest automated weather, we can go here, so we can view either Springfield ATIS or Lake of the Ozarks AWOS, or for some reason we have a user airport with an AWOS, but this is a good way for if you want the current altimeter and you're not on flight following, you can tune up the nearest AWOS and get that pressure reading. Now, the Waypoint Information screen is going to be very similar to this. However, you're going to need to search for the waypoint. Now, if you click on airport, it's automatically going to import the one that we are navigating to. So if you remember, we loaded Stockton up earlier. If you're on the ground with no flight plan loaded, it's going to default to the airport that you're at. If you want to modify that, you can click on here and type in whatever waypoint you want. And then you can view all sorts of good information about the airport. So if you want to view just general information, like say elevation, fuel service, time zone, you can view that here. If you want to preview or even load a procedure for that airport, you can come here and view the different approaches, and then you can directly load and activate the approach right here. You can preview the runway information, so it has the orientation, the length, the surface type, and traffic pattern, as well as pilot controlled lighting. And then if you want to view the frequencies associated with that airport, you can do so as well. You can preview it on the map and just see what it looks like, which is very similar to the runway preview. And then if there's any METARs, TAFs, or PIREPs for this airport, you can view this information here at the weather button. And then if there are NOTAMs, you can view some of the NOTAMs here. I will recommend, this is not an approved source for NOTAMs, so it may have some of them, but it's not going to have all of them. So just make sure you're talking to flight service if you want to get the full NOTAM briefing for that airport. So you can view very similar information for, intersections, VORs, NDBs. If you need a VOR frequency, it's really easy. Pulls up the nearest VOR, and then you can see here's the frequency for Springfield. The user waypoint button will show a list of user waypoints if you have any. However, I don't have any. And if you want to enter one, you can create a waypoint here. I am going to plug another one of my videos because I'm not going to go into detail on how to make a user waypoint. But if you want to learn how to make a user waypoint in a GPS series navigator, click the video in the top right-hand side of the screen and we'll walk you through step by step. So let's run through the flight plan screen, which is kind of a step above in complexity from the Direct To screen. So if you want to just go straight to a waypoint, hit Direct To, type in the waypoint, hit activate, super simple. But if you want to load a sequence of navigating to waypoints or airports or whatever in a flight plan, you're going to do that here. So let's load this up, simulate like we're going to fly from Bolivar to Jefferson City to Lebanon. So we will start with our starting waypoint. You can see Bolivar is pre-populated in here. And then let's add Jefferson City. So I want to go to KJeff, hit enter, there's that leg. And then we can load Lebanon here. And now you can see that I've got this nice flight plan loaded up. Now, if we want to activate this flight plan, we can hit the Direct To button, go to the FPL key, and we'll start by navigating to Jeff City. So we'll hit activate. We've got our magenta line going to Jeff. Now here in the menu, we can view a couple of different things. If we want to store this flight plan in the catalog, we can hit store, and there it is. If we want to access the catalog at any time, just hit the catalog button, and here is our stored flight plan. If we want to access and say reload this flight plan here in 2 weeks, we can just hit activate, or we can invert and activate. So if we're at Lebanon and we want to fly to Bolivar through Jefferson City, we can just hit invert and activate, and it will reverse that flight plan and activate it. So it's kind of nice if you have one going. You don't need to delete it and re-enter it, you can just invert it. Now you also have the option to delete the current flight plan, invert the current flight plan, or fly a parallel track. So if you want to fly a couple nautical mile offset from this plan to, I don't know, dodge an airspace, something like that, it's configurable right here. Now here you can also edit the data fields when creating a flight plan. So you have desired track, distance, and cumulative distance as your default options, which I typically like to keep, but if you want to modify them, this is configurable here. And lastly, when you're loading a flight plan, you can preview it to make sure you've got everything right. So we've got our first leg from Bolivar to Jeff, and then our second leg from Jeff to Lebanon. So this looks good. Now from the procedures screen, you can quickly load different procedures for the airport. So if you're flying in or out of a class Bravo, you can load departures and arrivals right here. And then if you want to shoot an instrument or a visual approach, you can load an approach right here. So you have access to all the different options from GPS to ILS to visual approaches. If you want to load an approach, just select it, hit load approach, and it will put it in the flight plan. And if you want to activate it, press activate. If you need to modify your transition, if you're not getting vectors, you can choose to transition through a waypoint. Now, I'm not going to go into much more detail than this just because I'm not instrument rated and don't want to give out bad advice on shooting approaches. But if you want more information, talk to your avionics installer, flight instructor, or reference the pilot's guide. It's got really good information about how to do approaches. So here we can move to the utilities screen. Now, the GNX 375 has some really good utilities built into it that may not deserve their own screen on the main menu, but it's still worth talking about. The first utility is going to be the VCALC screen here, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And this is going to calculate when you need to begin your descent to reach the destination airport at the desired altitude and the correct distance from. This does rely on a current flight plan or navigation. So say we want to do a VCALC for Jefferson City. So you can select your target altitude here. So you can either choose an altitude above the waypoint or you can choose it to be MSL. So I typically, flying pattern altitude, I just put in 1,000 feet above the waypoint to get me close. But if I want to specify a very specific altitude I want to hit, I'll change it to MSL. Just note that it's not going to be dynamic like above waypoint is. Your vertical speed profile is going to be your descent rate as a rate of feet per minute. I like 500 for when I fly, but maybe some of you faster guys want to be at 1,000, so that can be configured in this screen. And then lastly, you can adjust your offset. So this is going to be the distance from. So this would be, I want to be 1,000 feet above the waypoint, so roughly traffic pattern altitude 3 nautical miles before Jefferson City. So you can see it kind of flows, and this is typically how I have it configured. So 3 miles is good at the speed that I go, but if you're flying faster, you can bump the offset back. And then you can see that it's starting to count down and say that in our current flight plan, we need to begin our descent in just over 30 minutes. Now, if you remember from our map screen discussion earlier, I have this user field up here that counts down the TOD time. So instead of having to bounce back and forth between the map and the VCALC page, you can just view this time here. But it will give you a message 1 minute before you need to begin your descent. And then it'll give you another message when it's time to descend, and then another message when it's time to level off. So once again, I'm not going to make us sit here for 30 minutes and wait for the VCALC to run through, but I do have a dedicated video for how to use the VCALC function on the GPS series navigators. So if you want to see it step by step and what this looks like, click the video up here on the top right-hand side of the screen, and you can see that. Moving on, we can talk about the fuel planning utility, which is nice because it takes the guesswork out of fuel planning. Now there's a couple of different ways to configure this, which we'll walk through each of the different ways. So now you have a couple of different inputs that you need to enter before you can hit compute and view your fuel usage. So you can select your starting waypoint here and your ending waypoint right here, or press P position to import your current location. Now the mode, you can shuffle between point to point and flight plan. We'll come back to flight plan right after we run through point to point. And then you can configure your fuel on board and your fuel flow. Now, if you accurately entered that when you booted up the device, this should be a relatively accurate number. But if you want to overwrite it, you can click on it and overwrite it here. Now the last thing to enter is going to be your ground speed, or if you're in flight, you can just hit use sensor data and it will go ahead and import that field. And then you can press compute. So here from our current location to Jefferson City, it says that we need 6.8 gallons. We're going to have 50 gallons remaining. And then it gives us our reserve time, total endurance time, and then our range and efficiency numbers. So this is really handy to know, like, hey, I'm going to have plenty of fuel for this leg, so I don't need to worry about it. And the reserve is nice to make sure that you're legal for VFR or IFR flights, depending on if you need a 30 or a 45-minute reserve. Now, like I said earlier, this can be configured for a flight plan. And I really like this for viewing catalog flight plans. So your active flight plan will be here at the top, and then all your catalog flight plans will be at the bottom. So even though this is the same flight plan, we'll view it from the catalog. Now this is typically done on the ground. I guess you could do it in flight, but you'll want to enter your ground speed and then do the same fuel on board and fuel flow, and then hit compute. We have the option here to view the entire cumulative flight plan. So we need 15.4 gallons for the entire loop. Or if we want to view it by the individual leg, we can do that as well. So here's the fuel data for the Bolivar to Jeff City leg. And then here's the Jeff City to Lebanon leg. Now the beauty of doing it here is it actually subtracts the subsequent legs from your fuel amount. So you can see fuel after leg is 41 gallons, whereas from Bolivar to Jeff was 47. So this is really, really nice if you have a good complicated flight plan, and you can view how much fuel you're going to use throughout each step and figure out which airport you need to get fuel at. So I'm obviously a huge fan of this utility. It's really, really nice. Now the density, altitude, true airspeed, and winds utility is also a very nice one. Now you have a lot of fields that you do have to configure, but once you get it, it's really helpful. A lot of this can be just grabbed from your instruments in the airplane. So our indicated altitude, we'll just pull in at 3,500. We'll do standard pressure. And our calibrated airspeed, let's say, is 134. Outside air temperature is 22. Like I said, these are all arbitrary, but you'll enter the accurate information. And then our heading, I don't know, let's see, 069, we'll say our heading is 073. Now your track and your current ground speed can be pulled in with use sensor data, or they can be modified. And then you can hit compute data and it will calculate your density altitude, true airspeed, the wind direction, wind speed, and your relative head or tailwind component. So this is really handy for if you want to figure out what you're truing out at, or if ATC asks you for a PIREP, you can give them winds loft information right here. So some of these other utilities are not as important as these first three, but we'll still run through them. You can do a rain prediction right here. So if you need rain for a specific instrument approach, you can forecast that coverage. So select your waypoint, date, and time, and then hit compute rain, and it will tell you if it's available or not. You have the option to set flight timers here. So we have a power on timer that's going to start counting up when you flip your avionics master on. And then it will also tell you the current time that you went up in the air. Now these are configurable, so you can do a power on time or in-air timer, just depending on how you like it. So it's really good for logbook entries or an alternative to a Hobbs if you ever need that. You can configure scheduled messages in this unit, so you can select the message that you want to display here, and then you need to select your message type. So one time is going to go off after a designated interval. An event is going to go off at a certain time and date, and a periodic message is going to go off after every set interval of time. So if you put 15 minutes in here, you're going to get a message every 15 minutes. I personally like this one as a reminder to switch tanks every 15 minutes in cruise for all the low-wing guys out there. The last utility is going to be where you can view logs. This is primarily for your avionics installer, but if they ask for diagnostic logs, you can export them to your SD card here. So the last screen from the menu is going to be the system screen, which is where you do a lot of the configuration. So you won't spend a lot of time in here because most of it's set up by default or from your avionics installer, but there are just a couple little nuances that I like to tweak in here that I'll share with you. The first one is going to be in the setup screen. You can change your nearest runway criteria. So here you can specify, hard only, hard soft, any runway, or water, depending on what type of aircraft you're flying. And then you can give it a minimum runway length. And you can choose to include or exclude user airports from that list. You also have the option to change your CDI scale from auto or set it to a designated interval. I typically leave it on auto and just let it adjust as the instrument approach requires it. And then if you want to enable or disable the CDI here on the flight plan hotkey, you can do it as well. I really like the feature, so I like to turn it on, but if it's too busy for you, turn it off there. So you can also configure your page shortcuts here. So remember we talked about with this lower right-hand knob, You can switch between the different screens. This is where you can configure these. You don't have a whole lot of options like the GTN series, but it's nice to have. I do like to have it from map to traffic to flight plan, but it's whatever you want. And lastly, if you're going to connect this device to, say, your smartphone or an iPad to use like the Garmin Pilot app or ForeFlight, you can manage your Bluetooth paired devices right here. I know it's kind of tricky to get it configured sometimes, so I figured I'd just show you where that's at. Okay, so that's it. That is the Garmin GNX 375. I thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you made it to the end, it really means a lot. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. I'll try to get back to you. You guys fly safe, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.